Ooh, new banner information. Let's go over this and tell you what's worth it and what's not. I'll go over the character banners first, then the weapon banners, and then give you my overall recommendations at the end. We'll start with the character banner and then go on to the weapon banner. So we've got Raiden, Sayu, Sara, and Rosaria. Interesting there. And of course we've got Ayato as the counterpart. Well, let's make this easy. Between Raiden and Ayato, it's Raiden. She is way better. And Ayato's not bad at all, but Raiden, she is something special. Raiden is a character that is very good on her own, and when she was first released, I was saying that she is a character that's only going to get better with time because of the way she's built and the unique mechanics around her, and that's shown to be true. She's really good in a hyper carry team on her own, but she makes really good teams like the national team even better. And with the advent of Dendro reaction, she is really good in hyper bloom teams as well. If you put her in the national team with Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Bennett, you have one of the strongest teams in the entire game that's also one of the easiest to play. And if you have very limited characters and you get Raiden, you can still make an incredibly strong team with characters that everyone gets for free. A team with Barbara, Dendro Traveler, Kale, or Lisa, and Raiden is a super budget-friendly but extremely strong Hyper Bloom team. And as you get better Dendro and Hydro units, that team becomes even stronger. Not to mention that Raiden is very free-to-play friendly because one of her best weapons, the catch, is something that you can get for free from fishing. And some of her best artifacts come from domains that are very high value, so you don't have to worry about wasting resin. Almost all of the time you're going to be using a 4-piece emblem of the Severed Fate set. It is incredibly good for her, just like it is for so many other members of the cast, but it was tailor-made for her, and it does an amazing job at amplifying her damage by a lot. And if you wanted to run her in Hyper Bloom teams where she's doing tons of damage, all you need to do is give her a ton of EM and either the Gilded Dream set, which comes from the Gilded and Deepwood Memories domain, which is a really good domain to farm. But if you really wanted to max some Hyper Bloom damage, you could give her the 4-piece Flower of Paradise Lost artifact set. Though this artifact domain isn't super high value, so if you were going that route, I'd probably just stick to Gilded anyways. Regardless, if you do get Raiden, she can make your account feel way stronger. Ayato, on the other hand, is interesting because he is built designed to be a hyper carry, but his damage isn't quite the standard hyper carry levels. And what I mean by that is Zhao and Hu Tao have kind of been the gold standard for hyper carries in Genshin for a while. And Ayato isn't quite reaching those levels of damage on his own, and so what ends up happening is his best teams end up being kind of a bunch of random characters thrown together. To give you an example of this, a lot of people like to run Ayato with Yunjin for the normal attack buff, but it oftentimes just feels a lot better to run him with Fischl and do a bunch of Electro Charge instead. And speaking of 4-star character synergy, the 4 stars on this banner don't really synergize with Raiden or Ayato that much. Now of course there are some exceptions, so let's get into it. First up we have Sayu. She's a decent Animo 4-star character and kind of like a mini Jean. She does less damage than Jean, and she's not quite as good as healing, but the fact that she is a character who can swirl, who is a Viridescent support, and a healer is really nice because she's consolidating some very important roles altogether. So while Sayu is not nearly as broken as an Animo 4-star character like Sucrose, she still is very nice to have, especially if you don't have a lot of Animo support. Next we're moving on to Kujou Sara, which is one of my favorite character designs in the entirety of Genshin Impact, but unfortunately she is just not that fun to play. Think of her as basically Faruzan but Electro. You use your skill, then you get a chance to do a special charge attack, and then that special charge attack gives your characters a buff. But using charge shots for a bow to then shoot something on the ground to make a buff to then switch into another character just doesn't feel good, and most people really don't like this playstyle. Especially coupled with the fact that generating energy for Kujou Sara this way feels pretty clunky, and you definitely want a lot of energy because her burst cost is 80, and you want to use her burst because it's very strong. All of these factors just make Kujou Sara feel pretty unfortunate to play. And her Constellation 2 does make this feel a lot more palatable, but it's still not great, which sucks because she's such a cool character. Next up we have Rosaria. She is by far the best 4-star here. She's similar to Kaya with relatively short elemental skill cooldown and some good energy generation that comes out of it, but she also has a good burst that does good damage and no internal cooldown, so it can melt, freeze, etc. quite a lot. So she's a good character because she's got good cooldowns, good skill, good burst, good damage, good energy generation, check. And if you'd like to know more about how good Rosaria is or what teams to play her in, I recently did a reverse melt team guide, so you can check that out if you want to know how she can be utilized very effectively. Next, let's move on to the weapon banner, and we'll start with the 5-star weapons and then we'll move on to the 4-star weapons. But suffice it to say, this weapon banner is pretty good. The sword on the banner, the Haran Geppaku Futsu, is pretty nice. Even if you don't use its secondary passive, it's still a nice stat stick that gives you crit rate and increases elemental damage. And the secondary passive increases your normal attack damage when two other characters that don't have this weapon equipped use their elemental skills, and then you switch to the character that has this equipped to use their elemental skill. It's not exactly hard, but it is a passive that you do have to kind of think about, especially if you're going to use it on a character that you want to use on field for normal attacks like Ayato or Keqing or likely Alhaitham. But the crit rate, the good damage, and the elemental damage bonus are all super nice, so even if you don't use that passive that much, you're still getting a pretty good weapon. Now the Engulfing Lightning is pretty interesting because it is a weapon based entirely around giving you a ton of energy recharge, and then giving you more attack the more energy recharge you have, so it kind of synergizes with itself. Now this is obviously great on the Raiden Shogun who wants a lot of energy recharge anyways, but to no surprise it's also incredibly good on the Spear Archon herself, Xiangling. And it can also be surprisingly effective on other characters. While it's not the best option for a lot of them, it can actually make a lot of other characters feel pretty good. For example, a character like Zhao has a ton of energy needs, and even though he's typically not built with energy recharge in mind, it can actually be pretty nice for him, especially if you don't have another 5-star option. But as always, and I say these every single time, the 5-star weapons on these banners are a gigantic trap. Don't roll just to get one of them, but if you do happen to get one, especially on this banner, just know that these two 5-stars are fairly versatile. Now the 4-stars on this banner are actually really nice. We've got Favonious Lance, Lion's Roar, Sacrificial Fragments, Mouun's Mouun, which is the bow, and Akuoumaru, which is the claymore. First of all, the Favonious Lance is really amazing. I wish I had like 5 R5 versions of the Favonious Lance. The passive is really amazing for a ton of different characters, and it's also really good for your entire team, and there's so many polearm characters that can really utilize this to a great effect. The Lion's Roar is a very interesting weapon because it's great for characters that run in teams with Electro or Pyro, even if they are not Electro or Pyro themselves. It's obviously good for a character like Keqing, but it's also very good for a character like Reverse Melt Kaya. It's also really good for Bennett, and I use it on Jingqiu with Electro or Pyro teammates in the national team, and it works really well because I have plenty of energy recharge, so I like the Lion's Roar for the extra bit of damage. And of course this works very well with Ayato because you're typically always pairing him with either an Electro off-field damage dealer or a Pyro off-field damage dealer. Then we have Sacrificial Fragments, and this is really good for Sucrose and Nahida, or really any Catalyst user who wants EM or could use the passive to use their skill more than once, but it's mostly just Nahida and Sucrose. Next we have the Mouun's Mouun. This is really good for characters that rely on their burst to deal lots of damage and can't get a better use out of a weapon like the Stringless. So this can be a decent weapon on a character like Sara, but it is also nice for something like a Reverse Melt burst focused, not charge shot focused, Ganyu. And then of course we've got the Akuoumaru. It's very similar to the bow, it has the same passive, and this claymore is also very good for burst focused claymore characters. The first one that comes to my mind is Beidou, because powering up her elemental burst would make a significant difference in the amount of damage she deals, but it can also be pretty good on a character like Sayu. Now it's time for recommendations. Since this is a rerun banner, most people know that they're either going for Ayato, or they're going for Raiden, or they're going for both. But if you are unsure, Raiden is much better value for you overall than Ayato is. She's just got a lot more she can do, she's much more free to play friendly, and her damage is also really nice. The 4-stars on here are decently nice, and if you're a new player you can make some pretty good team combinations with both Rosaria and Sayu. But Kujou Sara is not really worth investing into unless you're going to run a hyper carry Raiden. And even then you want Kujou Sara at least C2 and more than likely C6 if you're going to do that playstyle. So overall, character banner is okay, but Raiden is definitely worth it if you want to go for her. Now the weapon banner is actually quite good, and this might be one of the only times that I say you may want to use a few wishes on the weapon banner. The weapons are all really good, they're very versatile, and even if you get one of the 5-star weapons, you can find a use for it somewhere because those are pretty versatile too. Again, trying to get a specific 5-star on a weapon banner is a giant trap, but if you're throwing a couple wishes in, trying to get a couple 4-star weapons because you need some more for your team, that's not a bad idea, especially on this banner. But I'd like to know your thoughts on these banners. I've seen a ton of comments from other videos where people are really excited about Raiden, and others who are really excited about Ayato. And does having a nice weapon banner change your priorities or your budget as far as what you were going to roll for? I personally wasn't planning on using any primogems on the second half of this patch, but considering the weapon banner, I might throw a few wishes in. And I'm really curious if you're feeling the same as I am. And if you're curious about what other characters are really high value and good for you, I have that video linked down in the description below. And YouTube will also link you something that they think is really good at the end of this video. So make sure you like the video and sub to the channel. Stay jawsome, have a jolly holiday. May order guide you, friends, and I'll see you in the next one.